StackCast. Episode 12 this week is featuring Dave with Start9. Dave, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and your project really quick, and then we'll jump into the deeper stuff. How about that?
Yeah, my name is David Croissant. I'm working with Start9 Labs. I've been working with open source technologies and sort of evangelizing for most of my adult life, and I kind of been playing with computers since I was old enough to break one, and no one was around to show me how to fix it, so I had to kind of figure it out on my own. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here today, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Let's get into Start9. Let's not waste any time. I know you're on a little bit of a tight schedule, so I don't want to spend too much time on introductions, if that's all right.
Sure, appreciate it. So Start9 is a company that was created because originally we kind of saw this need for people to easily run Bitcoin nodes, right? So Bitcoin and Lightning specifically, because it's very complex to run a Lightning node, especially several years ago when the interfaces were early to non-existent, and it was very kind of complex setup. And so in the course of just kind of sorting that out, kind of stumbled across a larger problem, which is that actually there's a need to bring data centers in general, this idea of running a server back to the home and the home office, and to make it more of a personalized device. And I like to liken this to back when computers like the ENIAC used to take up an entire room at a university and only the military had access to them. They cost millions of dollars and took a dozen experts to operate one. We're now speaking on laptops, and we have phones in our pockets that are more powerful. I think we can do the same thing with data centers, where we can bring home small devices, shelf-top device that would sit about the size of your router, sit next to your router. And just like your router, you can kind of forget that it exists. And instead of accessing a server in the cloud, which just means someone else's computer, you can access your own server, and then you can federate, you can share information from that machine as you wish in a voluntary manner, as opposed to giving all of your digital property over to a third-party company.
So in a way, it's for all the kind of non-custodial crypto fans out there, basically the same thing, but instead of talking about your currency, you're just talking about kind of all the competing data in general, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like the idea of digital property, because we have a really relatable idea is that when you walk in your home and you close the door behind you and you're inside your home, it's generally considered that whatever you do inside your home, as long as you're not causing harm to other individuals, is your business, right? And so whatever's inside your home is private by default. And the way that we generally use the internet right now is kind of the opposite of that. We take all of our data and we put it on a third-party server, sometimes encrypted, but often not, or encrypted by a third party that we have to trust with their, that they're running the encryption that they say they are. And then we have to ask for permission every time we log in accordance with the 300-page terms of service that often don't get read, in order to access that digital property. And so I kind of like that metaphor of it's kind of the same thing as your physical photos. They're just digital, and there's no reason to give them to a third party if it's easy and accessible to run a server on your own, which is the mission at Start9, is to make this technology accessible. And I should mention that it's not just us. This is a huge movement, and an industry is springing up around this, as we speak.
Definitely. And I will say I've never considered that to be an easy thing to do personally. I've never heard of it being made easy. I am not familiar with the kind of any of the companies looking into this at all. You are the first person I've spoken to about this. And so I'd love to learn a lot more specifically about what makes Start9 different too. But before we get into that, I did say I didn't want to spend too much time on I did say I didn't want to spend too much time on introductions, so that we could be sensitive to your schedule. But at the same time, I am curious, what got you interested in this kind of topic in the first place, and what got you interested in doing something about it yourself?
Yeah, definitely. So I come, I thought this would be kind of a common story, but I find that it's not so common. When I was about 13, maybe, I was kind of fortunate to get relatively early access to the internet, albeit slow. And there wasn't really an instruction manual. There was no search engines at the time. And so you would kind of just, feel your way out into these rabbit holes and kind of learn whatever it was that you wanted to learn. And at that age, I was kind of just soaking up whatever I could find. I was interested in anything and everything, with all the pros and cons that go along with that. And one kind of corner of the internet that I found at the time was these philosophical ideas of anarchy. And it didn't really sit with me at the time. I didn't really digest it. I couldn't fully understand it, but it did resonate, this idea that we don't really need a third party or a centralized organization to tell us how to live peacefully, that we can respect each other and do so just using common sense and understanding of the world around us and what it means to do no harm, and the golden rule, karma, natural law, all these different concepts that have been around the world for thousands of years in all religions and major philosophies. And so I got interested in that, but I didn't really understand it. And then about 10 years later, I really started to read on the subject and really understand it. And that kind of brought me to this, and that combined with my interest in technology kind of meshed into this idea of that was popularizing at the time of decentralization or distribution of networks and data, and taking sovereignty over our own digital property. And so I kind of came at it from an anarchist philosophy, and that's how I kind of got interested in these kind of ideas.
So you say you've been in this space for about 15 years or so. That's quite a while to have been interested in this topic and to kind of finally be really doing something larger about it personally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, when I first started learning about these concepts, like I said, was quite a while ago. And then at the time when I kind of melded it with technology and found out about open source and free software foundation and these kind of movements, was about 15 years ago. And that's when I really started to kind of realize that this was my passion. I didn't realize it at the time, but it's slowly became my passion, and now it's pretty concrete that that's what I'm here to do, and that's what I'm here to work on. So what we actually build at Start9 is an operating system. So it's a Linux distribution, and the entire purpose of this Linux distribution is to make it accessible for people to run server-side software and to host their own data. And so what that looks like, we also sell hardware as a means of paying the bills, because the software is open source, so you can download that for free and put that on any kind of old garage PC that you find, an old laptop. Some people find old servers on the internet, things like that. So that's freely available to download and put on any hardware you'd like. There's no permission needed from us. There's no cost. You don't have to give us a dime. But if you do choose to buy a device from us, we do sell plug and play hardware to pay our bills and to keep operating. So the experience, if you buy a device from us or once you get this set up, is essentially that you'll plug it into power on the wall. You'll plug it into your router with an Ethernet cable. You'll turn it on, and then you'll visit start.local in a browser. And that'll run you through a setup process, which essentially just has you select the drive that you want to install to. If this is a setup that you've done yourself, the drive's already selected if you buy it from us. And then basically set a master password. And then when your password's set, it sets up encryption keys they're set up at initial setup. So Start9 has no knowledge of what these keys might be. We have no access to them in any way. And then the device is ready to run essentially on your local network. And what that means, just to take a brief step back, every home and small office that has a router, that's a network. So a router creates a network. And on that router, there's what's known as a firewall, which kind of manages incoming and outgoing connections to that network. And then when two routers or three routers or whatever are connected, those become interconnected networks, which is what we call the internet. And all the internet is just a ton of interconnected networks like this. So on your home network or your office network or wherever you set up your personal server, once you're set up, you can access the device from your browser, or you can set it up with your phone if you'd like, whatever you want to use to access it. And then you kind of just leave it with your router, forget that it's up there, and you can begin to install your server-side software. So what the device comes with when you set it up is just the operating system. So it has the ability to do backups, make connections, You can change some configuration and do some customization and things like that, but it comes with no software. And what you do is you'll go to a marketplace just like you are used to on a smartphone or from your app store from your Mac or whatever. And then there's a one-click install of whatever it is that you might want. So you might want to install, for example, Nextcloud. Nextcloud is basically a drop-in replacement for Google Suite or iCloud, things of that nature, that allows you to sync files across all your devices and keep a calendar and contacts that are all in sync across all your devices, things of that nature, with the major advantage being that it belongs to you and it doesn't belong to a third party, and you don't have to give any of your data to a third party, and you don't have to make any connections with any third-party companies. And then another example might be that you might want to run a Bitcoin node or a password manager or a chat server. So what I'm getting at here is that there's a lot of flexibility that's very generalized, and you can run whatever it is that you desire. So if you're a small business, you might have very different needs from someone who's just wants to operate a device for their family and share photos and things of that nature. Probably a good place to pause there and see if you got any questions on that process so far.
Yeah, so just for anyone curious, the device that you're selling, what exactly would you call that? I say for anyone curious, I'm curious, what do you call it itself?
Yeah, so that's that's kind of an evolving thing. We're kind of Start9 and the industry around this and the other companies, the other individuals and the people in this movement are kind of coming up with this language as we go. Start9 right now, we call them personal servers. Some people might call it a private cloud or a personal cloud or something of that nature. But we're going with personal server for now, and we'll see. It kind of complements the personal computer, personal server. We don't know if that'll catch on, but that's what we're calling it right now.
Yeah, that does seem like the most simple way to refer to it. And then on the topic of servers, how would you describe exactly how everyone's computer, smartphone, etc., in a household using this, for example, would interact with it?
Mm-hmm. So this would be a good place to kind of take a step back just in case people aren't familiar with what's known as the client-server model. So the client-server model is essentially the way that we use the internet, on a daily basis. And what it means is that there's a server. Clients and servers are both computers. Just start with that. But a server is a device that's generally on 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. And it's always accessible, and it's serving your data or your software, whatever you want to access, and that's why it's called that. And then a client is like your phone or your laptop, something that may or may not be on all the time, that you use to connect to that server, and then you use the software or access the data, whatever it is that you're getting on there to do. So a common example would be if you take a picture on your smartphone, and then you upload it to usually a cloud service. So like iCloud, Google Drive, Microsoft OneDrive, I think is the name of theirs. These kind of services. So that's a client and a server, and that's kind of how they operate. And when that server belongs to a third party, you are essentially giving that digital property to that company. And a lot of times in the terms of service, it'll say something along those lines. And then the difference is when you're running your own server, a personal server, the interaction is going to be the same. You're not going to use Google. You're not going to use Apple. You're going to use something like Nextcloud or similar. There are other open source software packages, and the choice is yours with which one you want to use. But Nextcloud's very, very powerful and popular. If you're using Nextcloud, it's a similar experience as far as that photo getting synced to your device and then being available to all your other devices, or syncing directly to them if that's what you prefer. But that device belongs entirely to you, and no one else has access to it unless you give them access. So, for example, you might want to create your family members' users on Nextcloud. So you are the server administrator. You can allow them to sign up as users, and then you can all have various groups. You can have chats within that. However you want to, go about using that server.
So 2 questions.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, Nextcloud, is this a subscription-based service, kind of like like OneDrive, like you were mentioning?
Yeah, so this is a big advantage actually that personal servers have, is that because you own this software, so this is open source software that you've downloaded to your personal server, that you run on your personal server, and there is no subscription fee of any kind. And better than that, no one is going to advertise to you. This is your server, so you're probably not going to advertise to yourself. You're probably not going to censor your social media posts if you choose to interact in the social media, like in the Fediverse or something. You're probably not going to track your location. You're probably not going to collect all the metadata that is provided by having access to your software and your data or at least the metadata. So not having subscription fees is one reason that we actually think that this industry and this movement is about to really explode, because we're starting to see, any one person might be getting nickel and dimed on quite a few cloud services. So for example, a few bucks here for a streaming account like Netflix, a few bucks here for your iCloud account, a few bucks, you can see it starts to add up. And after a while, when you're paying whatever that is per month, you might realize that actually it makes more sense for me to just buy a personal server, run the stuff myself, and never have to pay a subscription fee.
Absolutely. And then I'm assuming there are a handful of different options as far as which direction you could go in with cloud-based services like that, correct? On the open source kind of side of things.
Oh, as far as like using alternative cloud services instead of running them on a personal server, is that what you mean? Or do you mean what are the alternatives to cloud streaming services?
Yes, exactly. I'm assuming that you've used one as an example, but I'm assuming that there are several other kind of options out there.
Yeah, so this is one of the beautiful things about open source, right? And I don't know, maybe your listeners have already heard the metaphor of open source being like a recipe for like a food recipe. The idea being that I might make a recipe for a chocolate cake or something, and I might hand that down to my kids, and they might say, "Oh, I want to put some more sugar," or "I want to take out this ingredient," or whatever. That recipe is freely available to anyone that picks it up, and they can make the changes as they want and use it as they wish. It's the same thing with open source software. The recipe is just code instead of ingredients, and that code runs software. And so the beautiful thing about the open source movement is that we have lots of different options of how to do things, and lots of different forks of various projects that may contain features that you want or don't want, and you can kind of pick and choose how you want to do that. Now, this can also get overwhelming when you kind of look at the open source software landscape and you're like, oh, well, I just want a way to sync my files, and I don't know which one of these things to pick. The way that Start9 is handling that right now, our kind of strategy towards this is that we have so I mentioned that we have a marketplace similar to like an app store that you're used to getting your apps on a smartphone. The way that, we build, we're always thinking about what happens if something goes wrong with the company, right? So what if Start9 becomes evil, or Start9 gets arrested, or Start9, dies in a plane crash or something? There has to be a way for the community to continue this on. And so we have a marketplace. What we call it a marketplace because we consider that like the broad ecosystem, right? So there's a marketplace, and then within that marketplace, there are registries. And you can kind of think about this like the marketplace is a mall, and the registries are stores in the mall. And you can visit whatever store you want. You're not tied to any one in particular. Now, the one that is going to show up first and foremost when you load up your operating system for the first time is the Start9 official registry. And on that registry, there will only probably ever be between 20 and 30 different kind of services to choose from. And the reason is that we're curating that, and we're saying, we're putting our name and our reputation behind the fact that these are reputable services. They've been well tested. We know that they function well, and that they will do the job that they advertise that they do. And then we have a community registry, which is sort of anyone that wants to publish their own service on our marketplace that didn't quite, meet that criteria for, we only want one or two of each thing, right? So I think we have 2 messaging platforms on there right now. We have Nextcloud as a cloud platform, things of that nature. You can see where I'm going with it. And then the community is other people that wants to be. The community registry is also available. You can click a button right in the middle of the marketplace to swap to that registry, and then see the other services that people have submitted to us for the community registry. And then the really interesting part is that there's a button for add registry, and you can add the URL of any registry that anyone publishes anywhere. And so if our registry disappears, people can continue to access other people's software repositories and get software from each other. And so unlike Google and Apple, with their kind of centralized app stores that, they're often censoring or, kind of have odd requirements that may not be entirely in line with freedom principles all of the time, things of that nature. Instead of those centralized models, we have this ability for anyone to spin up their own registry and publish their own software. And then for anyone familiar with the Android ecosystem, they will probably be aware of the APK package type, which means that you can get an APK file from anywhere that one is published, and then you can install that as an app directly to your Android device. And we have the same concept we call an S9 PK, and you can get an S9 PK from anywhere that is published, and you can install it to your device. And of course, that's at your own risk. But if your buddy comes over and he's got a flash drive and it's got some piece of software on it, and he's like, "Here, check this out," he can hand it to you. You don't even need an internet connection in order to get that software. And so you can see how we're kind of trying to engineer this such that Start9 is not a central point of failure. And so that the community can carry this on, regardless of what happens to the company.
And you mentioned, I believe, that you use a certain Linux distribution that you created.
So what StartOS is a Linux distribution. So Linux is really a kernel, which is a very low-level portion of an operating system. And above that is what's often known as a distribution. So you've probably heard of Ubuntu or Debian or Mint or Arch. These are all kind of different flavors, so to speak, of Linux. So we've made our own flavor of Linux, and it is based on, currently we use Debian as a base. And so people familiar with that ecosystem like Ubuntu and Mint and things like that, they would find it familiar if they went under the hood. But we generally recommend that you don't need to do that, right? So this is your device and it's open. If you want to, you can set up an SSH access, which means you can go into the terminal and, I equate this to lifting the hood on your car. And if you want to get in there and work on the motor, you can. Now, if you pull something out and it breaks, be aware that we may or may not be able to help you. We will, we'll do our best, but, so in that way it is open, but the way that we've designed it is so that it's a nice and simple UI that's accessible, but still powerful for people, so they can access everything in a friendly user interface instead of having to memorize command line, commands, having to get into configuration files and set specific environment variables and flags, and we kind of try and take all that out of it. So that it's more accessible to folks. So it's been possible for a long time to build a server on your own, but it's required that you memorize terminal commands and you understand how to put together configuration files and set flags and environment variables and all these sorts of things that most people just don't have the time to learn and to do. And there's no reason that they should, right? So not everyone needs to know how to build their own furniture. For example, in the same way, not everyone should know how to take apart and rebuild a server from scratch in order to get all the benefits of running their own server.
All right, so I had one other question that had come to my mind earlier, and that was just when you mentioned that you do not have to purchase the personal server device itself, you can use your own computer, whatever you have at home. Are there any constraints on what can be used to run the software itself?
Yeah, so we we do build with the idea in mind that this should be, again, accessible. And so we want this to be able to be run on lightweight computers. And so the first computer that we built this for was the Raspberry Pi, which is a kind of a hobbyist computer that a lot of people are familiar with. It was readily available at the time and inexpensive. That kind of changed over the last couple of years. They became a little bit more expensive, and there were some supply chain issues. And so since then, we've added builds for general architectures, chip architectures such as x86-64, which is probably the most common. That's most of your Intel and AMD chips are going to be in that format. And then as we do have an ARM build as well, which is a little bit less common. It's going to be. It seems like it's getting more common now with the new Macs, and a lot of the small board computers and things like that run on ARM as well. We have a list on our forum. If you go to community.start9.com, there's a list of well-known hardware. So hardware that people have put this on, and they know that it runs well. And then we have our range of devices, which we provide official support for, which is the Raspberry Pi, the Intel NUC, and a sort of a customized Intel NUC built by the company Purism, which goes down into the firmware level and even open sources the firmware. So it pulls out all the Intel management engine kind of nonsense that they have in there, pulls out all that proprietary stuff, and leaves us with an open source boot stack. So everything from when you turn the device on until you boot into the OS, that's all open source as well, or at least 98% or something like that. There's some small portion that Intel claims the chip won't run without. But, we're starting to get into this territory of, okay, well, we have all this beautiful open source software. We now need open hardware, right? We need to understand what the chips are doing, because at the base level, that's running all the data through it. And so we need to know that we have open hardware as well. And so that was really cool for us to be able to partner with Purism to bring that device. And that's kind of our flagship product this year. I kind of forgot the original question, so hopefully I didn't stray too far from the point. I remember you were asking about building your own hardware.
Yeah, no worries. So I was under the understanding that there was just one kind of type of device hardware device, that you had available to purchase, but there are actually technically multiple options then.
Yeah, so we currently have the three products, the Pi, the NUC, and the Purism device. So we call those the Raspberry Pi device we call the Server Lite, the NUC device we call the Server 1, and the Purism device we call the Server Pure, because that has the most possible open source components that we could find on the market at the time. So we have those three products, and then for the NUC and the Purism device, we also have options on the size of storage that you want. I don't remember exactly, but it ranges from 1 to 4 terabytes of storage space. So if people have a lot of photos or videos, things of that nature, they might want to lean towards more storage space. And of course, you can also upgrade these devices if you want. So in 3 years, if you've filled up your 4 terabytes, at that time, an 8 terabyte will probably be much cheaper, and you can purchase one, go through a transfer process of your data to the new drive, and you can continue using the same hardware. So we try to also make sure that they're upgradable as well. To the best of our ability. These are very kind of, small platforms. They're about the size of a few decks of cards stacked together. Again, about the size of a router. So we're as flexible as we can be. And then on the kind of DIY side, the people that are building these at home, the very popular options for that is often Raspberry Pi was the most popular, but it's kind of starting to see some constraints as far as, you can only run so much on it at a time. So people are kind of leaning towards old business computers. So computers that have been running in banks and corporate offices, and they get retired and then refurbished and sold. They're very inexpensive and very powerful devices. And especially because we keep our software stack very light, that allows, kind of the maximum possible, you can run the maximum possible software on these as a result.
So what you're saying is you could easily run the software on like an old ThinkPad, or I don't
Yeah,
know.
absolutely.
That's what comes to mind for me. But what about like a $300 Chromebook?
A Chromebook would be an interesting one. I don't know. I think that they run Linux at a very low level, but I don't know how difficult that transition might be to a full Linux distribution. Um, but again, like these business computers that I'm talking about, they're available. They're readily available right now for between $100 and $300, and they are probably much more powerful than a Chromebook. Maybe
Oh,
not a new
absolutely.
Chromebook,
I don't think Chromebooks are probably very popular with this audience to begin with, but I had to ask. It was something I kind of bookmarked mentally earlier, like, well, you said a very simple device.
yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if someone had done it. We definitely get a lot of cool hack together videos from people all over the world, and it's really cool to see people building it and repurposing old hardware, because it's cool to be able to recycle stuff instead of it going into a burning landfill or something. So it's nice to be able to bring new life into that old hardware.
Absolutely. I love that idea. And is there do you have like a channel or something like that where you kind of feature any of these examples of the builds people put together?
So the forum would be the best place, probably, because it's sort of easily laid out and searchable, and you can find everything readily there. We've probably featured several on our Twitter page, which is at Start9Labs, START, the number 9 labs. And then people occasionally drop into our Telegram community, and they might post some pictures there as well. But I would say the forum is going to be the easiest place to find that stuff, just because it's easy to search. It's laid out nicely.
Great. And then I have to ask just so I can come back here and find it later. You mentioned your Telegram community. How can people find that?
Yeah, it's just Start9 community on Telegram. I don't know if there's if you search for Start9 community, it should pop right up. I'm happy to provide you a link after the show if you want it for your show notes or whatever. But
Absolutely. Any links that you have that you'd like to be included, if you mention them here and then maybe go ahead and send those over if you have a moment, then we'll make sure that those get
sure,
included.
yeah, I'll just make a note to send this to you.
And then before I forget to ask here, before we kind of begin to wrap things up, you did mention that you are not the only business in this space working on this type of project. What do you feel sets kind of Start9 apart from whatever competition may be out there? I'm not familiar with what they would be, but could you maybe
Yeah,
do that?
yeah, that's a great question. So there are several companies that have sort of been around for a long time, and they sort of enable this kind of functionality. And so among those companies would be like Synology, Western Digital. They're often storage companies. Western Digital produces hard drives. But these companies that are producing NAS devices, NAS, which is network attached storage. TrueNAS is another one. These companies are a little bit ahead of us as far as some of the feature set that they offer. But then where we shine is that we have built this from, like, those were kind of built as storage devices, right? They weren't, they didn't quite have this concept in mind. And so they're sort of, while they have some similar functionality and they have some features that we will be adding in the near future that we don't have yet, they're not quite on the same page that we're on, if that makes sense. We're building this from principles of freedom-based principles and from principles of decentralization, and this idea that we want to decentralize data centers specifically. And then on sort of the other side of things, there are several groups, organizations, and companies that have produced so somewhat similar devices that are focused on becoming node devices, Bitcoin nodes or Ethereum or what have you. There's a lot of projects that kind of center around being a node device, and some of them have started to shift as they're kind of seeing what's happening here. They've started to shift into that same realm of sovereign computing that we've kind of pioneered. But to my knowledge, we're kind of blazing the trail in that regard, as far as having all of having everything in one package, coming from the beginning with these principles and with these ideas, and keeping it community operable, whether or not Start9 continues to operate. I think we're the only ones that are really doing it like that, and we also have a very powerful tech stack. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that. There are a lot of projects that are essentially creating a nice interface for using what's known as Docker, which is a containerization scheme, an idea of you can run lots of different services and they are all separate from each other, which is good for security, and you can run them in a very lightweight manner. And we actually utilize Docker right now as well. But what we've built is we have a backend that's built in Rust programming language, and that backend kind of operates the containerization, and that can be Docker, and that's what we've been using now, but it's modular. So we could, in the future, use different containerization schemes as well. And then it also operates or communicates back and forth with the front end in order to keep that nice display constantly updated. We have a custom database as well that helps keep the user sort of up to the second with information that they may need. So, connection status and health checks for each service, so that you can immediately see if there's a problem with something. There's, kind of getting into the weeds on some of the feature set, but we do a lot of the systems administration work is done by the machine, but it's presented to the user such that they can make decisions about what's happening. And so if there's a problem, it might just say, like, you probably need to do this to fix the problem. And the user, okay, well, I'll probably take that action. Or it might say, in order to run this service, you have to configure this other service. So for example, if you wanted to host a website using the Ghost blogging software, which we have, you might want it to point to a certain place with storage for your files that are going on your website, like Nextcloud. And so you would install Ghost, and Ghost would say, you need to let me access Nextcloud so that I can get those files if you want to set it up that way. And so that's all presented in a friendly manner to the user, so that they can just kind of point and click and decide how they want it to run.
So at what level do you think a user would need to be at in their understanding of these concepts to be able to operate the hardware without much difficulty?
Yeah, I mean, so we've been doing this for 3 years now, and it's getting really to the point that it's very stable, and it's getting a lot easier to use. It's sort
Software.
of been in...
I'm so sorry, I said hardware. Software.
Well, I mean, it is both, right? Because all software...
To operate the hardware, you have to operate the software, right?
Exactly, yeah. And so this is your hardware and your software. So, and they do interact, obviously. Yeah, so we've sort of been in this beta phase for the last 3 years, and we're now working on our third overhaul of the OS, our third major overhaul of the operating system. And this one is really going to kind of lay the foundation for what we consider, will probably be close to a 1.0, so to speak. So coming out of the closet and into the world, and making it available for the masses. And at that point, we'll kind of have an equal feature set with what everyone expects from big tech and cloud services, like Google, for example. Probably the only major piece of software that people request highly that we probably won't have available soon would be an email server. And the reason for that is that while you can run your own email server, most email is going through big tech servers such as Amazon, Google, Apple. And if they don't recognize where that mail is coming from, there's a good chance they either don't deliver it at all, or they deliver it to spam. And so we kind of see email as perhaps a technology that might not just be, it might not be well suited to this new paradigm of sovereign computing. But luckily, there are lots of open messaging protocols that are probably ready to step into the forefront and take over the role that email has played. as well as, for like registration and authentication, we have all kinds of new fun toys to play with, such as Noster and things of that nature that we can maybe use to build these new tools.
And as far as email services go, are there any that come to mind to you off the top of your head that you would suggest going with at the moment?
I personally don't like email. I hate that every website that I go to, it's like, give us your email. I'm like, why?
No,
Why do
I'm
you need that?
not a huge fan of it either
Yeah.
personally, but it's
So
kind of a necessary evil still at the moment.
yeah, I mean, there are a lot of services that have been around quite a while that they offer some cool features. Tuta Nota, Proton Mail. Some people are gonna hate some of these suggestions. Some people are gonna like them. But my stance is kind of that it's a great technology. It maybe could have been saved, but at this point, it probably hasn't been, and it might be time to move on. So that's kind of my personal position. But there's some good email providers out there, and sometimes there's some good email providers and they get shut down. So, for example, LavaBit or C Templar. These are some other good choices that either had to shut down voluntarily because they couldn't continue to operate, or because they were under pressure from a governmental organization. So I can't on good conscience give any personal email recommendations, unfortunately.
That's all right. You had mentioned it, so I thought I'd go ahead and ask, well, if this is not something that's you're looking at being able to really support at any time in the future, what would be maybe the best alternative for someone that is maybe looking into Start9?
Mm-hmm. And to be clear, I'm not saying that we wouldn't have an email server. It's very possible that we would, and even if we didn't, someone else will probably package one up, because that's the nature of the community. They don't have to wait for us. They can do it themselves. The community developers, and so I would be surprised if one didn't make its way on there. And kind of looking into the future, once we own all of our data and we own all of our software, sort of the next logical step is that we start owning our network connections. So sort of the final boss, as it were, of sovereign computing is the ISPs. This is the internet service providers, your Comcast, your Verizon, your whatever it is that you have. Typically a duopoly or a monopoly in most towns, in most big cities. That's kind of the final boss. And so once we've kind of established personal servers, the next logical step is that we start making sovereign connections with each other. And if we have that, we might be able to maybe we can raise email from the dead, and we can kind of have a better decentralized type of email system. I'm not sure. So I'm not going to say email's dead, but I'm not a fan right now. We'll put it that way.
It's fine. It's fine. You're free to share your opinions on email here. Well, before we wrap up, I always ask, are there any accounts you'd like to shout out, websites, resources, anything of the sort?
Yeah, the best place to learn about what we do and sovereign computing in general is start9.com, START, the number 9.com. We're on Twitter at Start9 Labs. I'm not sure what other social media we have, to be honest. I know we're out there, but the forum is a great resource, community.start9.com. Our Telegram is a great resource. There's always people in there, all hours, that are willing to help explain what this is, and they're also giving. We have a random channel that's always loaded with some really cool advice. People talking about doing graphene phones and just sharing tools with each other. So it's a really cool community, and I'm really happy to be a part of it.
Awesome. Well, I'll go ahead and get all those included in the description down below for anyone interested in looking into Start9 a little bit more. And Dave, thank you so much for your time today throughout accidental technical difficulties and all. I really appreciate you coming on here and spending a good amount of time with us now, I think almost an hour, kind of detailing everything about the kind of hardware and software side of what you're working on.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. I really appreciate the opportunity, Alexa. Thank you very much.
No problem. And we're going to go ahead and wrap up episode 12 here. And for anyone watching, we will see you next week for episode 13. Thanks for watching again.